Today's run of show is as follows. We'll start from Craig and then hear from Mark and then conclude with Brad. And then we'll open it up to your questions and the experts will provide answers. You may, during the Q&A, you may submit your questions either via chat or by using the raise hand feature, in which case we'll let you know when you've been unmuted, I should say, and you are good to go to ask your questions. We got a lot to go through. Let's get right underway. Craig, over to you.
Yep. Thanks, Joe, for the great introduction. And thanks to everyone here for taking the time out of your busy schedules, especially right before the weekend. As Joe mentioned, on January 13th, more than 19 million Taiwanese voters will head to the polls. It goes without saying that this election carries immense significance. It will not only shape Taiwan's future and its foreign policy, but also have far-reaching implications for cross-strait ties and U.S.-China relations. While domestic issues such as economic and energy policy are obviously critical in this year's election in Taiwan, far and away the paramount concern revolves around Taipei's relations with the mainland. To sort of help put this election in context, it bears a remarkable resemblance to Taiwan's election in 2000, which was Taiwan's first serious multi-party race. It was in 2000 that the now ruling Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, secured its first presidential victory ever. And much like in 2000, the stakes are very high today. The latest polling suggests DPP candidate William Lai remains the frontrunner, with the KMT's Ho Yui polling in second, and Ko Wen-je from the Taiwan's People's Party, or TPP, is sitting in a distant third. A lot, of course, can happen between now and the election late next week, and the polls could very well be wrong, just as they have been here in the US and in other countries. Remarkably, though, all three candidates more or less advocate for continuing a version of the status quo with China, rejecting formal declarations of independence, pushing back against China's territorial claims, seeking to maintain strong ties, particularly defense ties with the United States, and firmly rejecting China's reunification framing. Before we sort of dive into the potential election outcomes, I just want to foot stomp that Taiwan's election is about much more than Taiwan. This election will serve as a crucial litmus test of the Chinese Communist Party's political warfare strategy, namely whether Beijing can achieve its stated reunification goals through non-kinetic means only. China has more or less thrown the kitchen sink at Taiwan, and the payoff remains to be seen. But the election also holds major implications for the US and our upcoming election. All told, in 2024, over half of the world's population will be voting in democratic elections, and authoritarian regimes are actively working to influence those outcomes in ways that are favorable to their interests. A recently declassified U.S. intelligence community assessment revealed rampant Chinese interference in the U.S. 2022 midterms, and it suggested that Chinese election meddling in 2024 could reach new heights. In many respects, Taiwan serves as a testing ground or an incubator, where Beijing refines its political warfare techniques. That is before exporting them globally to mold an ecosystem that's sympathetic and conducive to Beijing's broader geopolitical ambitions. These sort of corrosive methods, which include propaganda, disinformation, rigorous censorship, and even the strategic capture of foreign elites to influence decisions at high levels, all pose a major threat to democracies holding elections this year. As it pertains to Taiwan's election, there appear to be two likely outcomes, neither of which correlate to a lessening of tensions in the near term. Either the DPP prevails, as polls suggest, or the DPP is removed from power. Should the former occur, Beijing will be forced to contend with the fact that its years-long marathon of military drills and narrative-shaping efforts failed to deliver the intended result, which has been very clearly the DPP's defeat. In the case of the latter, the DPP's removal, Chinese decision makers may believe they have hit upon a winning political warfare formula, one that expertly blends provocative military posturing with disinformation. In that case, an emboldened China may begin evaluating how it can replicate its success in other countries, including the United States. And this is really concerning in light of that recently declassified intelligence assessment I mentioned. To date, there is no indication that the Biden administration has raised concerns about Chinese election interference with Beijing. That is according to official readouts of recent bilateral engagements. And failing to do so could invite even greater interference during the upcoming 2024 election cycle. But back to Beijing and back to Taiwan. So in the lead up to next week's election, Beijing's principal focus will remain reinforcing the narrative that a vote for the DPP is a vote for war. As a result, the People's Liberation Army will almost certainly maintain a very high operational tempo in and around Taiwan's territorial waters. That is during the pre-election period and most likely in the immediate post-election period. Just this week, the PLA's Southern Theater Command announced a new round of drills in the area. Others may very well be announced before the 13th. If the DPP emerges victorious, China's first move might not necessarily be directed at Taiwan. Instead, Beijing may quietly turn to Washington, urging the Biden administration to use its considerable influence to discourage the DPP from taking a victory lap or otherwise rubbing its victory in China's face. Remember, sensitivities are running very high in Beijing as Xi confronts myriad domestic and international crises, many of his own making. Xi's recent statements emphasize the urgency of reunification, making it unlikely for him to accept defeat gracefully. Meanwhile, the Biden administration will also be keen to limit, to the extent possible, any potential fallout stemming from a DPP win. Conversely, a surprise KMT victory would likely be met with a little bit of a sigh of relief from China, although it's far from certain that a future KMT administration would do Beijing's bidding. Of course, a DPP defeat could lower the overall temperature in the strait and potentially advance Xi's broader reunification messaging. But even though a future KMT administration could pursue greater communication with Beijing, the majority of Taiwanese people oppose reunification, which remains Beijing's resolute goal. That suggests to me that tensions may temporarily ease under a KMT administration, but Beijing will no doubt persist in pressuring Taiwan to choose a so-called peaceful reunification path, regardless of the ruling party. And that's sort of bound to cause tensions between Beijing and Taipei going forward. Shifting a little bit to the potential implications for US-China relations and China's relationship with the world, to say that China will be exceptionally attuned to global reactions to this election would be an understatement. Any international response, be it real or perceived, that deviates from China's preferred political narrative about the election will likely garner a very harsh Chinese counter response. Most governments, including the United States, will likely choose to maintain relative silence, prioritizing perceived stability over potentially stoking the flames with Beijing. But doing so also carries major unintentional risks. For instance, the Chinese could misconstrue Washington's muted reaction as indifference, which in turn could lead Chinese officials to embrace ever greater risk-taking. Over time, that overconfidence could very well lead to miscalculation or worse, war. Bigger picture, though, while many in the media have sort of hailed the recent meetings between US President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping as a harbinger of great power progress, in my view, this narrative really misses the mark. Instead, last November's summit, it merely extended the illusion of constructive engagement between the two superpowers, reinforcing rather than resolving China's contentious course. From my take, the principal paradox of the Biden administration's China policy lies in its unanticipated and unintended consequences. Far from mitigating Beijing's brashness, diplomatic overtures aimed at stabilizing Sino-US relations have instead emboldened Xi. All told, I think bilateral relations are set to deteriorate further in 2024, with Taiwan remaining a major flashpoint between the two countries. Still unclear to me is how Congress intends to conduct itself in the post-election period. The biggest outstanding question is whether U.S. House Speaker Johnson would travel to Taipei in May for the transfer of power ceremony. Back in 2022, I cautioned against then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi from traveling to Taiwan, arguing that the risks of doing so outweighed the potential gains. I think those predictions have been borne out over the last 2 years. The Chinese have expertly leveraged Pelosi's trip and its aftermath to justify, in their minds, a historic increase in their coercive activities against the island. Almost none of the countries in the region expressed support for her trip. Many subsequently blamed the US for unnecessarily baiting China. And all the while, at least in my view, is that Congress did what it often does, which is sort of oversold the value of the trip and then under-delivered in terms of ramping up weapons shipments to Taiwan or sort of addressing major defense industrial base logjams to support Taiwan's defense. There are, in my view, lots of ways that Speaker Johnson can and should show solidarity with the new Taiwanese administration, regardless of which party prevails. But unnecessarily baiting Beijing is not one of them, particularly as the US faces competing crises in Europe and the Middle East. With that, I'm going to turn the mic over now, I think, to Mark to discuss sort of how the election could impact U.S. arms deliveries and U.S. force posture, and then Brad as well to discuss some other defense-related issues.
Hey, thank you, Craig. I certainly won't be as organized or articulate as Craig, but I try to look at this this election through the prism of the three principal legs of our U.S.-Taiwan military cooperation, and those are equipment or technology, personnel, and then policy and training. In equipment, look, I think Taiwan has their own procurement has changed appreciably over the last 8 years, and people give this false dichotomy. Are they are they buying high-end stuff, or are they buying counter-intervention stuff? And the answer is they need a balance. The problem was the balance was completely on the high-end side, driven by the Army, when I say the Army, I mean broadly the military, and their desires to look like a high-end military that that thinks back to 2005 and beforehand, when they probably could have held off the Chinese on their own. And they needed to get towards that balance. Most of you have met Admiral Lee, who argued pretty aggressively for a counter-intervention military, to little avail. And he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, so that tells you how ingrained the opposition was. But they got to get that balance right. We're starting to see that. The balance is that pre-war they need a Navy and an Air Force that can counter Chinese pressure campaigns. So they need some level of F-16s, some ships that can get out there and and counter the Chinese pressure push. Once the war starts, those things have a very limited lifespan, and the only question is, do they do some damage on the way out? And then they need a counter intervention, and that's where you see the talk these days about manned portable air defense, anti-armor, anti-ship cruise missiles and drones and things, and a lot of mines, both sea-based and land-based. So getting at the election right there, I think that under a DPP win will mean that they continue to move that balance a little better, towards more counter-intervention and away from the high end, but they'll still be buying some high end, and they'll need it. I think if the KMT wins, that's the Army's old sponsors. And I think the old guard of the Army thinks, and when I say the Army there, I mean all three services, thinks that a KMT win might give them the ability to do more of that kind of old guard stuff. I'm not sure that's true, but that's the perception they have, and they'll certainly be pushing hard for it. The other part of procurements, the U.S. giving, and I think this could be driven by the election. Right now, we've been pretty aggressive. We have up to $2 billion in FMF authorized, up to $1 billion a year in Presidential Drawdown Authority authorized, neither one of which has been appropriated at anywhere near that level. But I do think you're starting to see our Congress push more and more chips towards that. So it's very likely that if you ask me 2 years from now, what would our combined FMF PDA be to Taiwan? I would say 2 to 3 billion is reasonable, and that would be added to their own, in current dollars, $19 or $20 billion defense spending, taken from about 2.4, 2.5% of GDP up to effectively about 2.93% of GDP. So that's big numbers. And the other end of that technology thing is the FMS backup, the foreign military sales backup. Brad and I wrote a year ago about a $19 billion backup pretty extensively and what the impacts were. I think it's a little less now, which is a mixture of some things have been pushed out the door, particularly as F-16s begin to deliver. That's a big chunk of that money. I think $4 billion. And And the other part is there haven't been a ton of big sales. They've been good targeted 250 to $400 million packages over the last year from the Biden administration. So that's how I see technology playing out. Personnel is the more interesting one. It gets almost no attention. Even domestically, it doesn't get the same level of attention. And the personnel is made up of two big issues. One's conscription changes. As most of you know, President Tsai pushed taking conscription from 3-4 months out to 12 months. Interestingly, while it appeared in print that it would start in January 2024, in reality, that's the piloting starts in January 2024. It really kicks in January 2026. We'll have to see how they do this. Are they doing the right training in this? And that's what they're supposed to be figuring out now in this piloting, weapons training, small unit tactics, organizing for future service in the reserves and the territorial army, kind of like the Israelis do with the IDF. Are they thinking that way as well? And then in the reserves, they on occasion claim they have 2 million people in the reserves, which they train about 100,000 a year. And most of you understand that getting trained once every 18 years does not, in fact, make you a member of a military reserve. And so they've got to make a really hard decision to crush it down. And they're thinking about this, the DPP and their leadership right now, to about 200 to 400,000 people, training them each every year, training everyone every year, kind of more like the IDF or even more like our National Guard. And getting that right. What are the election results on that? I think the DPP would keep conscription on the path it's on. They would look at a reserve change. Here's the problem with the reserve change. It would fundamentally change their army. Right now, their army spends 95% of its time thinking that they're a 1979, literally 1979 U.S. What's called the field manual army. That's what we left them with when we left in 1981. We left them. In fact, if you look at some of the organizational terms in there, there are ones that are like archaic to the U.S. Army now, but they still use. I say that because their army needs to will have to become about 40% of their time training reserves, which these kind of like hidebound traditional militaries hate doing. But it's what the IDF does. In fact, if you go to Estonia or Finland, they spend 80 to 90% of their time, the active army, training the reserves. It's a different fundamental vision of your army. And it's one that I think the old guard are going to push back hard. The minute if the KMT got in, they'd be pushing back hard on any of these ideas. So there would be an impact on these personnel changes, I think. The conscription and the reservists will probably become more of what most of us think is necessary under continued DPP leadership. That's my personal opinion there, and a little less of what they need. And finally, on policy and exercises, this gets at what Craig has referred to, the kind of like very public things that infuriate the Chinese. That's what this is. They're like exercises, the joint training team we have there. These are the things that when they leak into the press, really, cause the Chinese to overreact, to react aggressively, and then cause us to step back a little bit. But I think the joint training team needs to expand. It's supposedly between 200 and 300 people. I imagine it needs to be 1,000. It needs to change from SOF and kind of headquarters elements training to handling all of service support for all the military services, much more aggressively working with them so that we can interact with them and move beyond our deconflict. Right now, our two militaries are at best deconflicted, and they have to move up that integration ladder. And then we have to have exercises. Believe it or not, the vast majority, I would say 99% of their ship commanding officers and flag officers, admirals, have never done an exercise with the United States Navy, because the last exercise was in like 1981, which was 42 years ago now. So, I mean, same with their Air Force. They get trained in Arizona as young pilots, but then go to Taiwan and don't fly with us again. We have to change that dynamic, and that's going to create a lot of friction in the relationship. It's one I think the DPP can support, and the KMT will be loath to push. So I really think on these policy and exercise kind of issues, it's much more likely that the DPP will support the kind of exercising that if the Indo-PACOM commander is really interested in being able to military work with and support Taiwan forces in a combat condition, he or she is going to need to have exercised with them, worked with them ahead of time. And to do that, you need this kind of much more aggressive push. And I think under the DPP is more likely. Last thought I'll have is, if the DPP wins, there'll be a lame duck period. And some of the more painful, contentious issues President Tsai could handle. There's a whole separate topic about nuclear power I could talk about, but on the military end, I think the reserve changes and maintaining the balance and pushing it more, a little bit more towards that counter intervention could be done during a lame duck period in a way that a future President Lai didn't have to be the author of the decision. He could just be the beneficiary of it. And President Tsai could do that. I think their lame duck period is almost 4 months long. So, I mean, real opportunity there. All right, Brad, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Mark and Craig and Joe. Thanks to you all for joining. I'll try to be quick here because I'm excited to get to your questions. Just maybe a few big picture comments, a quick comment on the ramifications of the elections, kind of in the hard power domain, if you will, and then a few quick comments on DOD, the Department of Defense. So you kind of get the domestic politics, the Taiwan stuff that Mark just said, and then maybe some more DOD stuff from me. Very quickly on the kind of starting at the broadest level, but I think it's important for framing this, right? When we think of a threat, right, it's two things. It's political will and it's military capability. So when you're talking about the election in Taiwan, right, you're talking about potential impact on political will in terms of how much our Taiwan partners want to work with us and the impact that has on Beijing's thinkings and actions. The point on political will, whether you're looking at a partner or an adversary, is that it can change quickly. I mean, you can wake up, eat the wrong thing for breakfast, and your political will changes, or something happens in the news and that changes what a political leader is willing to do or is determined to do. But military capability, as we all know, takes time to build. And so and that's no way saying that political will or political dynamics are not important. My point is that these things can change quickly. And so you really got to keep your eye on hard power military capability, because if an adversary is building that capability and it matches up with what they're saying they want to do, that's kind of a scary formula. And I'd argue that's exactly what we're seeing with Beijing, as reconfirmed by the October 19th annual Pentagon report to Congress, the 2023 annual report to Congress on military and security developments involving the PRC. So just so when we look at that military capability, just to put a few clean, hopefully eloquent words on it, is we see them matching actions with words. I mean, China is undertaking the most significant military modernization effort in the history of the People's Republic of China. They're conducting increasingly aggressive military exercises. They're taking steps that look like rehearsals for a blockade or even something worse than that. So they're doing all the things that you would expect someone to do who means what they say. And just a quick reference to the Middle East, I think the events of October 7th are a reminder that sometimes we should actually believe our adversaries when they say they want to do something bad, rather than kind of dismissing it as bombast. So there's a few quick comments on that. In terms of ramification of the election, with complete and total deference to Craig, who follows this much more closely, I would just say, if someone forced me to place a bet, I would say a DPP win probably results in increasing Chinese military escalation, and a KMT win, as Craig suggested, probably could be perceived in Beijing as a validation of their political warfare strategy, probably resulting in increased political warfare activity in the United States. I published a piece with one of our military fellows on November 3rd, 2020, arguing that great power competition was coming home to America, and talked in that about both Russia and China. I think China has the chance of making Russia look like chump change in terms of political warfare in the United States, and we better keep a close eye on that. I realize that's not a hard power thing, but this is all related, right? Because I know it's a cliche to quote Sun Tzu, right? But he says the acme of skill is to win without fighting. So if you can convince Americans not to fight, that's another way to achieve victory in the Taiwan Strait. So I just add that. Quickly turning to the Department of Defense. And as Mark Montgomery knows as well as anybody, the key things I'm going to be keeping my eye on, regardless of what happens with the election, is what the Department of Defense is doing to strengthen its military posture in the Indo-Pacific, particularly its forward basing. But if you're going to put our guys and gals, husbands, wives, sons, daughters in harm's way, we better make sure that they have the means to defend themselves, and that means hardening. It also means air and missile defense, something that Mark and I have followed closely in Guam and Japan and elsewhere. It also means munitions, another area that we've looked at closely. Do we have the right munitions? Do we have the right quantities? The answer to the question, do we have the right quantities, is generally no, we do not. Multi-year procurement authorization is great. Multi-year funding is essential and is not always there. So I'm watching that closely. Also, the longstanding American assumption that, hey, don't worry, we can get forces from the continental United States to where they need to go. Well, that assumption is dead and gone and should be buried. And we need to be doing a heck of a lot more, in my opinion, on contested logistics, as Mark knows well, and then looking more broadly at industrial production capacity, particularly as we try to arm Ukraine, make Taiwan a porcupine, help Israel, and also conduct the most significant military modernization we've done in 40 years. Lastly, just highlighting a few things in the most recent National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2024 that the president signed into law last year. Some elements in there that I think are laudable that Mark and I, had research that helped inform is the speeding the delivery of the Harpoon missiles. If I'm creating a list of the weapon systems I want Taiwan to deter aggression, I would say the Harpoon coastal defense systems is darn near the top of that list. And so looking to see what we can do to expedite those Harpoon systems and look at some interim capabilities, other creative steps. Mark is all over the training and exercises and advising. He's so right. The more that, what's the saying, the more we sweat in peacetime, the less we bleed in war. So, depending on who wins the election will probably, of course, affect the willingness to do public things. There's a lot that can be done privately. And absolutely, I think the Air Force and Navy are the most important services here from a U.S. perspective, but the Army has a real role, I think, in helping Taiwan with its reserve training and mobilization. So I'm eager to see the Army play the best role it can, depending on the political will in Taipei. And then lastly, as I said, air and missile defense, not just on the first island chain, but also in Guam, we'll be looking at. And then I know Mark and his team at CCTI, the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, have done great work on cyber defenses and what more we can be doing with Taiwan on cyber. So I will stop there. Thanks.
Brad, thank you. And Mark and Craig, thank you as well for the terrific analysis. Just a reminder that we welcome and encourage your questions. You can ask your question by either typing it into the chat box or by utilizing the raise hand feature. And while our guests are doing that, I do want to ask each of you, if you can, I detected a theme in terms of China's reaction and response to what the election results will be and the importance of how the Biden administration may or may not react. Craig, if we could start with you and then go to Mark and Brad, if you can flesh out a little bit and what might be going through the minds or should be of the White House, Congress, and perhaps even the Pentagon as the election results come forward.
No worries there. I think my sense is that the White House finds itself as a result of its general policy framework for Taiwan in a moment of fear, fear of what could happen after this election. There is tremendous anxiety that the results could lead the relationship to destabilize further, even though they have no interest in picking a political horse, even though I think that they're rightly justified on lowering the temperature in the Taiwan Strait. But I don't get the sense in my interactions that there's much of a plan for what comes after, just like there hasn't been much of a plan for what came after the APEC summit meeting. And so I think there's a really reactive wait and see approach from this administration as it comes to China. And we'll have to see. I think they'll largely be taking their cues from Beijing's reaction to the result.
Mark and Brad, if nothing to add,
one quick, what I'd say, one thing, I mean, I worry when I watch how we respond to like the Houthi attacks on our ships, where we're paralyzed with a fear of escalation, that we take no action, and that Brad and I have written and are continuing to be quoted about, we absolutely need to take offensive action against them. That's an example where deterrence is, as Brad said, both a capability and a belief that you'll use it. So from my point of view, is we can't be overly differential or nonplussed by the election. Elections, they're democracy. They get to have their election, they have their results. Our policy ought to be consistent, and it should be victor agnostic. That we believe, because of the Taiwan Relations Act, we both need to provide the weapon systems to Taiwan to successfully defend themselves. That's our foreign military sales program, and to a lesser degree, FMF and PDA, foreign military financing and presidential drawdown authority. But additionally, we need to demonstrate our ability and willingness to prevent a non-consensual Chinese takeover of Taiwan. And that means exercising our own forces, posturing our own forces, and where appropriate, exercising, working with Japanese, Australian, and Taiwanese forces. And that's what we need to continue to have a policy that consistently applies that. Now, look, if at some later date, the Taiwan say they want a different relationship, that's fine. I suspect that's not the case, no matter who's elected. But I think we need to be consistent about that. And this idea of this paralysis we have over a fear of an escalatory comment or an escalatory action is absolutely not, not helpful to U.S. national security interests.
Hey, Joe, I can just jump. That's great stuff. Let me just jump in real quick. Yeah, no, I think this is, I don't intend this to be a political sounding comment. I intend it to be what I think is a factual assessment of what happened. Deterrence of a major additional aggression by Russia in Ukraine failed. Deterrence failed. Yeah. So deterrence of aggression against the NATO alliance has not failed, thankfully, but deterrence in Ukraine failed. And the Ukrainian people, first and foremost, have borne a horrible cost as a result, and the United States and others have borne a cost as a result. We don't want deterrence to fail in Taiwan. I mean, if I'm thinking about the kind of world that our descendants are going to have in this century, I look first to the U.S.-China relationship, and that relationship is most tense in the Taiwan Strait. So what Mark's describing, the cute little term I came up with a while back, was provocation premise. I saw this in my time with Senator Kelly out watching the Obama administration. It's like, just the wringing of hands. Oh no, we better not provide javelins to Ukraine because we might provoke Putin. And we spend all this time worrying about provoking authoritarian adversaries. I for one think we should spend a little bit more time helping beleaguered democracies become more porcupine-ish to deter the aggression from happening in the first place. Those investments in deterrence are a heck of a lot cheaper than a major war that could have been avoided. So that all sounds very kind of vague and general, but if you buy it, it has real ramifications for what we need to be doing right now. And those NDA provisions I referenced earlier, and Mark Montgomery has said this for a while as well, is that we have a window, but a not forever open window to get big things done for deterrence, both for Taiwan directly and for ourselves and for things we can do together. And if you're looking at a 2027, 2028 timeframe, of course, no one knows when that would happen, but we have to put something there for planning purposes. And so we don't have an endless amounts of time to get big things done to strengthen deterrence. And so that's why I for one, and my colleagues at FDD, we're going to be really watching the administration's implementation of these NDA provisions, which I think many of them are laudable, but need to be implemented as quickly as possible.
Excellent. Thank you to each of you. We have a question from Michael Martina of Reuters. We will open up the microphone for you, Michael.
Hi, gentlemen. Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. You've made a lot of really interesting points. Two questions for anybody who feels they want to field them. The first, Mark, you spoke a little bit about it, the KMT. I'm wondering if you could maybe expound, or any of you want to expound. In the event of a KMT win in the election, what degree do you think there are people in the U.S. government or in the Biden administration who are concerned about a backpedaling of sort of defense policy that they've been pursuing over the past, several years? Do you think that's a real concern, or does the U.S. government have sufficient leverage to compel basically anyone who comes to power in Taiwan to continue that model? And then secondly, in terms of Chinese reaction, what do you think the risk of sort of a severe reaction? I'm thinking of, say, Chinese Coast Guard interdicting some ships in the Taiwan Strait, something like that. How severe do you think that risk is, and what would trigger something like that? Thank you.
I'll take the first one, then pass the second one to Craig. And he could probably answer the first one as well while he's doing it. What I'd say is, look, first, there's probably a difference between how much should they be and how much will they be concerned. I think they'll be very concerned about a KMT win. I don't think they should be. And here's what I mean by that. Look, do I think the KMT's will be less forthright and open about a discussion of U.S.-Taiwan military cooperation? Yes. And does that kind of probably hurt in the deterrence realm? Yes. But it's also democracies, have elections. Elections have consequences, and that's who the people of Taiwan elect. That's who they elect. And certainly, I'm sending my son over to Taiwan in 6 months over to Japan to serve on a U.S. Navy ship. I don't want to support Taiwan's democracy to a greater degree than the people of Taiwan do. Right. So I think, they have to the KMT will have to make the argument to Washington that they're equally concerned about the Chinese threat. And I think they will quietly, but they'll ask for a much more quiet level of support. Then my concern kicks in that this is about deterrence. None of us want the fight. We'll prepare Taiwan for the fight. We'll prepare our own forces for the fight, but no one wants the fight. The important thing is deterrence. And part of the KMT strategy will actually weaken deterrence, which is having a less vocal, upright, not aggressive, but like forthright public statement that the United States and Taiwan are working together to have a more effective defense cooperation. That serves as a deterrent. And I think we'll lose that. Having said that, they get to vote in their own party, and we'll work. I think the administration will work with them. I do think there's probably a little bit of excessive hand-wringing about the KMT winning right now, but I think in the end we'll be able to work with them as we work with the DPP, because the Chinese threat doesn't change no matter who's elected.
Yeah, I would agree completely with Mark's comments. I mean, I think the challenge, of course, is that democracy is messy and elections have consequences. I think we can fully expect that in the event of a KMT win, they will naturally order sort of a top to bottom review of all of the DPP's policies and sort of what's being discussed and projected forward in the bilateral relationship with the United States, particularly in the defense domain. That doesn't mean that they're going to overturn, sort of squash programs or big collaborative opportunities, but they are going to want to have a good sense of what's been agreed to that perhaps is not public. And so I do think it's natural that we could expect certain delays in certain areas of collaboration, but that certainly doesn't mean that those areas of collaboration will come to an end. On the question of risk, I think the risk is potentially, sort of quite high for a near-term miscalculation of some sort. Remember, China believes it enjoys incredible international top cover here. So few countries recognize Taiwan. Taiwan would be unable to sort of raise concerns in international fora like the United Nations about perceived Chinese belligerence. Beijing is particularly hypersensitive right now to a sort of myriad challenges that the regime is facing. The potential for personal embarrassment for Xi Jinping and the need to appear strong is alive and well in China right now. However, if China perceives that there is a potential consequence to escalation, particularly if that message is delivered by the United States, I think it may be forced to think twice. If the DPP wins, the Chinese are going to have to go back to the drawing board and evaluate whether its current operations are achieving desired political outcomes in Taiwan. They may decide that they need to escalate even further to achieve those objectives. I suspect that's what will happen. Our sort of role in this is to reiterate to the Chinese quite clearly that the U.S. will not tolerate any unilateral attempts to change the status quo in the Strait. I think we've missed opportunities in the last few engagements, both at APEC and during Secretary Blinken's recent phone call with Wang Yi to reinforce that very theme. I think sooner or later it's one that we're going to have to get more vocal about, particularly in light of Xi Jinping's New Year message and his increasingly sort of ominous rhetoric about reunification.
Hey, Joe, I would just add this real quick that, just reminding folks of, longstanding U.S. policy is that our security assistance to Taiwan is based on the threat from China. I'm thinking of the memo during the Reagan administration in the 1980s, that the amount of arms we provide is based on the threat. And as you heard me argue earlier, that the threat is dramatically increased. And by the way, I looked it up, according to Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense, today, we had 2 PLA aircraft cross the median line into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. That was today. And 1 PRC balloon crossed the median line. And on January 2nd and 3rd, you had 9 PLA aircraft and 4 PLAN vessels detected by Taiwan. 2 crossed the median line, and there were 4 PRC balloons that crossed the median line. So, this drumbeat continues. I'm not saying those are imminent preparations for war, but it's a wearing down. I would say it's the frog in the water dynamic. I think we should not get complacent is my main point.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad and Craig and Mark, for your insight there. We do have a question, and Michael, we can come back to you a little bit later as well if you have a follow-up, but we have a question from VOA's Tina Chung. Question is, what kind of message can and should the Biden administration craft to send to Beijing not to escalate after the election? What can Congress do to help stabilize the fear of escalation? I'll open that to any one of you want to take that.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of this just gets back to sort of the theme of the last question, which is that everything that the United States is doing is consistent with longstanding U.S. policy. There is no change in U.S. policy. There's been a lot of confusion, particularly on the Chinese side, because of a series of seemingly errant comments from President Biden and other officials in the administration about U.S. policy towards Taiwan. And I do think that there is value in being very clear in how we articulate longstanding U.S. policy, at the same time that we also congratulate Taiwan for conducting a free and fair election. I think it's possible to make clear that the people of Taiwan have spoken, they have agency over their future, and that they have made their own choice. And we can constructively urge the two sides to work together towards a resolution, one that respects both of their needs. And I do think that a lot more needs to be done in that space. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that, so long as perhaps the Chinese demonstrate a willingness to engage. And often we forget that it's the Chinese who are unwilling to constructively engage with either the United States or Taipei on issues of cross-strait relations.
A lot of the questions are, which are great, or, to my ear at least, sound like some version of what can we do to not anger Beijing or to not escalate. And I do worry that general impulse in the Biden administration will not serve us well. It didn't serve us well in Ukraine. It's not serving us well in the Middle East. And it will not, I predict, serve us well in the Taiwan Strait. I think the danger, this sounds, I think the danger here is American weakness. So, I mean, if we can make Taiwan a porcupine while making clear that we don't want war, and we can bolster U.S. military capability as much as possible in the first island chain while matching those military steps with a clear, status quo. We're not pushing for independence. We want to resolve this peacefully but making clear that it would not go well for Beijing if they resort to military aggression. I think that's the best way to avoid a conflict. So count me on the side of the ledger where more American strength is conducive to peace and is not destabilizing. I think we should spend a little bit more time thinking that way.
Our next question is from Mallory Shelbourne. She's with USNI News. And Mallory, over to you.
Can you hear me okay?
We can, thank you.
Thanks so much. Admiral Montgomery, I wanted to follow up on something you mentioned, the whole porcupine strategy. My understanding over the summer when I was in Taiwan is that, Admiral Lee had put forward this strategy, and, after he left, that strategy was largely rejected, as you mentioned. But it seemed like at the time that folks were sort of coming back around to balancing this porcupine strategy with other conventional capabilities. Is that your understanding, or do you think that there's still some of an uphill battle on embracing that strategy, or is it getting rejected?
So it's a good question, because I mean, there's the reality of what they're doing, which is a balance, right? They are now getting, they still, there's an outstanding order of M1A1 tanks that kind of makes your head hurt. But then, they've ordered and received multiple times now Javelins, and they've ordered, and I think they're tied up on Stingers, but eventually it'll be a Stinger replacement. You see a lot of mines. You see that the 4 most recent ships they've added are these 4 fast mine laying ships, and I think they'll add some more. They're talking to the Marine Corps about the Marine Corps' the shoreline mine warfare system they have, things like that. There are things you're seeing them do that make you say, all right, they're on the right track. They spend a lot on anti-ship cruise missiles, which aren't cheap, but are very good counter-intervention. And they're trying to spend more. We're just doing a very poor job of selling them, Harpoon. We're the worst salesman in the world, apparently, when it takes 3 years to write a, 50-page procurement, basically procurement order to get it started. My point on this is they are doing the right thing, but you're right that when you talk to them and you talk to their Army leadership, they still mention the high end part. When they talk about the balance, they steer it more towards the high end. Admiral Lee, if you spoke to him, would steer it towards the, really far on the low end. And I think they're ending in the right place. And I think President Tsai's cut the deck of cards pretty well herself. And I hope, if she's replaced by her vice president, that he keeps that cut at about the same spot. But it's a very hard, it is not a physical, I don't believe it's a well written out strategy of this balance. I think it's just something that they've achieved over time. And certainly our sales are doing it, although we did it in a very ham-fisted way. Our DASD wrote a letter that got publicly released that said you shouldn't be buying, I think it was SH-60 Romeo helicopters. It was probably the right thought by the United States. That's not how you talk to your allies and partners, through public releases that you leaked to like Politico or whoever they gave it to get it out in the press. Sorry about that, Phelan. That's probably the right, they've struck the right balance is what I'd say. And I am concerned that there is a portion of the Army, retired Army generals particularly, who, by the way, you also can name as future Secretary of Minister of Defense, future National Security Advisor, that there's a definite revolving door there that could come in and steer the balance back towards the high end, which isn't necessary. They need to keep the balance where it's at, or even a little more towards counter-intervention. Sorry for the long answer.
No, that was very helpful. If I could just ask a quick follow-up. So do you think when you say the deck is cut in the middle, do you think they're balancing it 50-50, or do you think they're leaning more toward the high end?
So let me say that differently. It's a mental middle and probably a dollar-wise, because F-16s just cost so much, that just isn't on the counter-intervention side. The weapons don't cost as much. But I think in terms of level of effort, it's starting to cut in the middle, that a higher and higher percentage of their forces are going to be involved in a counter-intervention campaign. That's where I see the level of effort of the forces is getting closer to that 50-50, but the level of effort of cash on procurement is invariably towards the high end. The equipment just costs, F-16s, the air-to-air missiles that go with them, M1A1s when you buy them, even Navy surface combatants. These are expensive things when you procure them. So I think the level of effort dollar-wise is probably still closer to the high end. But in terms of how you'll use your forces and impose your will on the adversary, it's much more counter-intervention. It's, getting towards the 50-50 counter-intervention.
One thing I would just add on to Mark's great points too is that Taiwan's economic forecast for 2024 looks pretty solid right now. We're looking at somewhere between maybe a 3 to 3.5% GDP growth in 2024. So they're going to have the financial resources to continue to make these really significant investments. President Tsai, of course, quite publicly and formally increased Taiwan's defense budget. There was a little hand-wringing in Taiwan about the extra cost and extra financial investiture, particularly after the emergence from COVID and some structural challenges that the Taiwanese economy faced. But 2024 looks pretty good. So I don't think it will be a matter of lack of financial resources. If there are shifts in behavior or purchasing, it'll come down to political will, and I think the results of this election.
Hey, let me add one other thing I should have said in my initial thing, is I think right now they're 2.4, 2.5%. And believe me, Brad and I have to defend to your editors when we write articles all the time, because everyone just defaults to the IPRI, the Stockholm Institute's kind of like, well, it's 2% because that's the base budget that's put in. But the way the Taiwans and some other East Asian countries do it is they have additional special supplementals, kind of like what we would call OCO back in the day, you know what I mean? Where there's just this extra money on top, or I guess a supplemental like we're about to do, I hope, with Ukraine. But, you have this extra money. and it adds up in the end to 2.4, 2.5%. I'm fine with however they get to it. That's fine. But it needs to be creeping up towards 3%. And I think that is a higher likelihood under the DPP than under the KMT. And the reason it needs to go up to 3% is if you're going to get us to match you, with with our own 3 billion, we better be getting to about 10%. That you're doing 30, you're creeping up from 20 billion over time to 30 billion, and we're giving you 2 to 3 billion. That's real money. That's the kind of money that can buy a counter-intervention military that can stop the Russian army in its tracks and can stop a Chinese intervention in its tracks.
Hey, Joe, let me just foot stomp Mark's great point there. I believe it's in the American interest to do foreign military financing for Taiwan. It's in our selfish national interest to do that. I also believe we should make much more aggressive and broad use of presidential drawdown authority to help Taiwan, right? Because we can get capabilities there quicker if you buy the urgency argument I'm making. If we're going to do those two things, for more foreign military financing to allow them to purchase more, and more aggressive use of presidential drawdown authority, then you have to explain that and sell that to the American public. And people like Mark and me are going to be a lot more persuasive in making that argument and doing what's good for us if there's a perception based in reality that Taipei is pulling their fair share of the weight. So I just think that's really, really important. And whenever I talk on these topics, I try to emphasize that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mallory. Speaking of Politico, we do have Phelim from Politico ready to ask a question. Phelim, over to you.
Thanks, everybody. Happy New Year. I really appreciate you doing this. Really quick, two questions. First one, something that Craig flicked on. Mark, at you, strategic ambiguity. Is this of any value? Biden has already, I think, 4 or 5 times said that it no longer is a thing. So what's your view of the value of strategic ambiguity as we head into these uncharted and potentially very tense waters? Second question, and this is to you particularly, Mark, but anyone else wants to fit in, U.S. arms deliveries. We know that Lloyd Austin last year launched a Tiger team to iron out the problems in terms of the bottlenecks. In October, Representative Mike Gallagher and Young Kim fired a letter off to the Secretary of the Navy saying that bureaucratic delays at the Navy was delaying the delivery of essential weapons necessary for Taiwan's deterrence. Your views on those two in the last few minutes would be super. Thank you.
So, and on strategic ambiguity, I think Brad and Craig got to weigh in, but I'll first say on that I'm not sure, President Biden didn't throw away strategic ambiguity. He stated the opposite, or he stated like, we're going to come to your aggression. And then of course he was rapid. I think you're right. He said it 4 times. It's been walked back 4 times, which is incredibly cunning of him. Right. I mean, you know what I mean? You could think this is like short-term dementia or incredible cunning. I'm going with incredible cunning. It really puts the Chinese in a tough spot about bitching about it when the next day, like John Kirby's walking it back. But on the other hand, here's what's important. In one of these crises, remember play a war game. We always gloss over this. And there was a good discussion by Jacqueline Schneider in I think it was Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy earlier this week, where she talked about how wargaming ought to be a little bit more about the politics and a little less about the war fighting. I agree, because every war game, I'm thrilled when DC apparently lets me go to war within the sniff of a Chinese action. I'm off killing things, right? But the reality is you need rapid decision-making in the White House. And the Chinese know that that's not our long suit. But you've got a president whose gut reaction every time asked is, Xi's a dictator and we're going to war if we have to, right? You got to love it, right? Because that raises that credibility bar where you say it's capability plus willingness to use it. Apparently we're willing to use it, right? There's a belief in that. So I like that he does that. I'm not sure, at this point, if the whole strategic ambiguity thing has any traction when you have him and most of the Republican presidential candidates saying they would go to war over Taiwan. On the issue of the FMS, look, the problem here is, I get they're going to put a Tiger team on this, and I'll bet they isolate 1 or 2 areas and speed it up by delivery of 6 or 8 months. But it's a broken process, and I'll give you the best example. When we needed a new weapon, when we needed to get harpoons to the Ukrainian Pelican, they were running out of Pelican missiles. They'd fired all their missiles that they were going to use. They sunk the Moskva, and they're getting very low on anti-ship cruise missiles. We needed to get them harpoon. It took 9 weeks to take launchers from Denmark, which had been in a museum, weapons from a third party, from another U.S. arms sale, and Boeing duct tape. And then 9 weeks later, the Ukrainians sunk 2 supply ships, Russian supply ships with them. When we say the same thing to DOD now, they're like, no problem, we'll be right back, 9 years. And they're like, that meets all the requirements, or say 8 years. It's insane. It is insane that there is zero innovation in the system. A task force isn't going to introduce an innovative concept. That can only be done by Lloyd Austin saying, I'm breaking the system and I'm ordering you to figure out how to get that contract done faster. The Taiwan harpoon contract that Kim and Gallagher wrote about it took 30 months to write a contract. That was effectively the same as the Saudi contract that had been done 2 years before. You just needed to do the name change thing that you do on a document. Taiwan for Saudi Arabia, probably like nation state for country we kind of consider a independent sovereign, whatever the words we use for Taiwan. That should not have taken 30 months. But you know what? The Navy GS-14 was given 30 months to write that, and he took 29 months and 29 days and got it done. That's insane. The process is broken, and I'm afraid what it takes is constant. There was a lack of congressional oversight in effectiveness. You don't get a $19 billion backlog on accident over 7 years. So from my perspective, this needed to be done much more. This is going to take more than Lloyd Austin having a task force. It needs to be a DOD top-down driven, probably by Kath Hicks, acquisition process, not a task force to find out how to make 1 or 2 weapons go faster.
I would just add, this whole issue has been a major area of focus for our Center on Military and Political Power. We've examined a lot of it through the lens of how is U.S. support for Ukraine slowing down or not U.S. security assistance to Taiwan. And so we've dug deep on that. We've looked at the 15 or so foreign military sales cases, major cases for Taiwan, and asked ourselves, to what degree is provision of or potential provision of those weapon systems to Ukraine hurt Taiwan? And in most cases, the answer is it is not. There are a few where it has created some challenges, but a lot of these will be resolved in the next few years. But there are a few cases that are troubling. That's not to say there isn't a problem. There's a major problem in the American defense industrial base. The arsenal of democracy is not what it used to be. We all know that by now. But it's fun for many to bash the State Department. It's important to note that the vast majority of these cases are approved very, very quickly by the State Department. If there's 2 long poles in the tent or 2 key problem areas, agreeing with Mark, you got to look at the service contracting processes, the contracting officers, retention of and training of contracting officers, and just highlight, Mark Montgomery and I wrote in our piece in the Dispatch, we can send it to anyone that's interested. If you look at the Harpoon Coastal Defense System cases, the amount of time it took to go from congressional notification to contract was the same amount of time from Pearl Harbor to D-Day. So that's not a formula for success, just to kind of say, and so you got to look at the service contracting officers, and you got to look at industrial production capacity. I know the Tiger team is looking at the contracting officer process, but we're still not seeing the results I would want to see. And and sometimes, people spend lifetimes studying acquisition things. Some of it's complicated, some of it's not. If you want a better American defense industrial base, buy more, buy more quantities, and use more multi-year procurement that incentivizes industry to make investments in people and in production lines. That's how you begin to solve this problem. And the last comment is this, based on my 9 years in the U.S. Senate, this is the issue, I would say, for the Article 1 branch of government to focus on. Focus on what does Taiwan need, what have they asked for, and when it is going to be delivered, and what can we do to expedite delivery, period. Everything else is details. That's what matters. And that's where Representative Gallagher and people like him are really punching above their weight, doing important work. That's where we need congressional oversight in the next year or 2 on delivery of arms to Taiwan and U.S. military posture and capability in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, I would just jump in and say, it's President Biden's prerogative if he wants to sort of overturn decades of policy precedent on strategic ambiguity. But I do think that his comments have created a lot more confusion than clarity. Strategic ambiguity is not actually about whether Washington would intervene should either Beijing or Taipei seek to unilaterally change the status quo. It's aimed at deterring either side from taking steps that could endanger the status quo. I think PLA strategists and policymakers and decision makers in Beijing assumed the US would intervene militarily in the event of a crisis, which in theory helps constrain China's calculus. I think my take is that strategic ambiguity continues to pay dividends, and that it's perhaps better to think about strategic ambiguity as operating along a continuum rather than something that's necessarily black and white. There's no doubt that the Biden administration has taken just major steps to improve U.S. defense posture in the Pacific. Secretary Austin has taken, I think, something on the order of 4 big trips in the last 3 years there. We've made serious investments that I think we can make better and more investments there. But the reality is that those investments, those trips have failed to change China's conduct. That's where we really need to focus our effort here, rethinking about whether U.S. strategy is achieving its stated objectives. Clearly, it's not.
I think we will end it there. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Brad, for the terrific insight. Thank you on the call, those of you on the call, for the excellent questions. Tip of the iceberg on this, all 3 of our experts are available for individual conversations with you. Please reach me at press@fdd.org to touch base, and we'll schedule a time for you to chat with 1, 2, or all 3 of them. As promised, we will get you the transcript and the audio recording of this excellent conversation to you as quickly as possible. A reminder that FDD is a nonpartisan research institute focusing on national security and foreign policy. Many thanks to my colleague Mariam for her terrific work and helping make this work. Gentlemen, thank you each for being on the call, and thank all of you who participated in the call. This does conclude today's call.
See you.